Famous people were on Titanic when it sank. One of the most well-known catastrophes in maritime history is the Titanic, and both its fatalities and survivors gained notoriety to some extent. On its inaugural trip to New York City, the ocean liner that perished off the coast of Newfoundland was hailed as the pinnacle of opulent travel. As a result, several well-known people made the decision to make travel arrangements on the sinking ship. A well-known fashion designer, one of the richest men in the world, and a British countess were among its most notable passengers. The majority of famous persons traveling first class were on board. Researcher Chuck studied the figures and dissected the characteristics of the survivors. He discovered that while 32.57% of the 175 male first-class passengers were saved, 97.22% of the 144 female passengers were. The majority of famous persons traveling first class were on board. Researcher Chuck studied the figures and dissected the characteristics of the survivors. He discovered that while 32.57% of the 175 male first-class passengers were saved, 97.22% of the 144 female passengers were. In the end, he discovered that only 14 out of 168 male second-class passengers survived, representing the poorest survival rates. His investigation revealed that the overall survival rate for women was 74%, whereas the overall survival rate for men was 20%. Here are 8 of the most famous victims of the Titanic disaster. Died: John Jacob Astor, millionaire. Astor, who was a famous Astor family member, contributed to the construction of the Waldorf Astoria in New York City. In addition, he was a science fiction author, inventor, and Spanish-American War veteran. Madeleine, his wife, found herself pregnant when they were touring Europe. The couple scheduled a trip home on the Titanic in order to guarantee that the child would be born in the U.S. Astor was last observed clinging to a raft's side. The disaster was survived by his wife. The Spartanburg Herald-Journal estimated his net worth at over $87 million at the time, or $2.21 billion now. On the Titanic, he was the richest traveler. Survived: Archibald Gracie IV, historian and author. Because of his comprehensive and thorough depiction of the Titanic tragedy, Gracie rose to notoriety after the accident. The historian from Alabama who had published a book about the Battle of Chickamauga during the American Civil War was sailing home on the Titanic. When the ship struck an iceberg, he was startled out of his sleep. Gracie helped additional passengers board the lifeboats after leading a number of women there. When the ship went down, Gracie came to the surface next to a capsized lifeboat. Together with other men, he was able to get to the summit, where they spent the majority of the night in balancing. On December 4, 1912, the historian became one of the first Titanic survivors to pass away after being saved. He was 54. Gracie's last words, according to the New York Times at the time, were, "We must get them all in the boats." Died: W.T. Stead, investigative journalist. Stead, a powerful editor, may have predicted his demise on the Titanic in a strange twist. The newspaperman conducted an explosive and contentious investigative series concerning child prostitution while serving as editor of the Pall Mall Gazette. He is recognized for his role in developing investigative journalism. Stead, a devout spiritualist, also founded Julia's Bureau, a psychic business, and a periodical devoted to the paranormal. He also produced a fictional work in 1886 that uncannily paralleled the Titanic's actual occurrences. The book, How the Mail Steamer Went Down in Mid-Atlantic by a Survivor, recounts the tale of an ocean liner that goes down in the Atlantic. Due to a lack of lifeboats, only 200 of the initial 700 passengers and crew members in the story managed to survive the catastrophe. Survived: Noel Leslie, countess and philanthropist. One of the most well-known passengers on the Titanic was Leslie, the Countess of Rothes. After getting married to Norman Evelyn Leslie, the Earl of Rothes, in 1900, Leslie, a well-liked member of London society, became a countess. On the Titanic, Leslie and her cousin Gladys Cherry made travel arrangements. Leslie and Cherry, according to biography.com, both survived on a lifeboat and helped other crew members row the raft to safety. According to reports, the cousins and crew member Thomas Jones argued in favor of rowing back to look for survivors, but the other lifeboat occupants decided against it. According to reports, the Countess assisted in caring for her fellow survivors on board the Carpathia. She was labeled the plucky little Countess in the press and a prominent focus of the post-disaster media frenzy, according to Encyclopedia Titanica. Leslie, who survived the Titanic disaster, rose to prominence as a philanthropist and served as a nurse in the First World War. Died: Thomas Andrews, architect of the Titanic. Andrews was not your typical Titanic passenger. The ship itself was created by the lifelong employee of Harland and Wolff. He sailed on the Titanic's inaugural voyage to inspect the vessel and offer suggestions for enhancements. According to the BBC, Andrews realized the Titanic was destined to sink as soon as an iceberg broke her hull. The 39-year-old shipbuilder then started assisting ladies and young kids into the lifeboats. The BBC also reprinted a White Star Line telegraph that stated, when last seen, officials claim was throwing overboard deck chairs, other objects to persons in sea. Other than himself, safety was his main priority. Died John Thayer, railroad executive. As a former cricket player and executive for the Pennsylvania Railroad Co., Thayer was well known in 1912. Following a trip to Berlin, the vice president of the railroad firm boarded the Titanic along with his wife and son. Thayer made sure his wife and their maid got into a lifeboat when the ship hit an iceberg. Before the ship sank, Gracie claimed to have noticed Thayer looking pale and determined on deck. Thayer's corpse was never discovered. His son managed to stay alive by jumping into the water and swimming to a capsized lifeboat. Died Isidore Strauss, co-owner of Macy's, and his wife Ida. According to Premier Exhibitions, the pair initially connected when a penniless Strauss relocated to New York City following the Civil War. Isidore eventually rose to prominence as a successful businessman and member of the U.S. House of Representatives after he and his brother bought Macy's in the future. Today reported that when the ship was sinking, a space on a lifeboat was offered to Strauss. He refused, stating that he wouldn't get on a raft before every woman and child had left the ship. Ida subsequently resisted leaving her husband. She reportedly said, "We have lived together for many years," when her husband pushed her to leave the ship. "When you go, I follow." Her maid was then instructed to board a lifeboat by her. In addition, she gave her a mink coat, joking that she wouldn't need it anymore. The Titanic's deck was where the couple was last spotted together. Ida was never discovered, but Isidore's body was pulled from the water. Isidore and Ida Strauss were honored with a cenotaph at Woodlawn Cemetery in the Bronx, New York that read, "Many waters cannot quench love, nor can the floods drown it." Died Benjamin Guggenheim, mining magnate. Guggenheim belonged to the wealthy Guggenheim family, who made their money in the mining sector. Along with his mistress Leontine Aubert and crew members, he was sailing on the ship. In Like Titanic, the tragedy that shook the world, Guggenheim is quoted as saying to his maid, "We will soon see each other again," that he was initially upbeat about the ship's chances. "It's only a fix. The Titanic will sail once again tomorrow." Guggenheim reportedly put a rose in his buttonhole and said, "We've dressed up in our best and are prepared to go down like gentlemen." Guggenheim's body was never found. He later gave a Titanic survivor a message for his divorced wife. "Tell her I played the game out straight to the end," he allegedly said. "Because Ben Guggenheim is a coward, no lady shall be allowed to remain on board this ship." That's it for today's video. Please like the video and subscribe the channel for future.